A very lovely launch so far, just lots of attention. I think the fact is the book subtitle says it all. It couldn't possibly be more timely, how the U.S. deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. We see that playing out in real life over the past couple of days.
We want to get into that. What we want to ask you is, President Trump, at least to start, President Trump said in his press conference with the UK Prime Minister at the White House about the moves being taken to, quote, lay the groundwork for a long-term peace agreement. The president saying this. Do you believe there is a long-term peace agreement that can be made between Russia and Ukraine?
Eventually, there can be. I'm going to go ahead and say that it's that the prediction that it's not going to end at all is wrong, and that it's going to end very soon is also not right. The reason is that I think that the steps that the Trump administration is taking right now, leaning so heavily into a Russia first approach, really kind of being quite flexible, seemingly appeasing Russia with some of the things that it's been seeking, like Ukraine out of NATO, Ukraine giving up territory. Outside of the construct of a negotiation doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. The onus is on Russia to compromise. The Ukrainians are more than willing to compromise. They might not say it publicly, but they recognize that they're not going to be able to regain control of their occupied territory, all of it, anytime soon. That might play out over the course of years. So it's really the Russians. It's in their court. The way that we help that along, we don't ease the burden on Russia. We put additional pressure on Russia. We continue to support Ukraine. We continue to ratchet up a pressure with regards to economic sanctions. And that is what gets Russia to the negotiating table.
There doesn't seem to necessarily be the appetite for a lot of folks in Washington to continue to support Ukraine. We actually saw this play out over the last couple of years. Every time a funding bill would come up, or the idea of providing aid or money to Ukraine would come up. In your view, make the case to us, to our viewers, to our listeners about why the U.S. should support Ukraine.
So first of all, we should grant the fact that the Biden administration didn't do enough to make the case to the American public. And at the same time, Trump, as the de facto leader of the Republican Party, even before he ran for office, was making the case that Ukraine was the bad guy, corrupt, Russia was the good guy. That is not a recipe to sustain resolve behind Ukraine. The merits of the case are pretty straightforward. Ukraine is on freedom's frontier. They're a bulwark against aggression towards Europe itself, NATO specifically, our strongest, most important security ally, and our most important economic partner. So the case here is that if Ukraine breaks, Russia advances, becomes stronger by taking over Ukraine, is more emboldened to conduct aggression against other, within its own backyard, empire building, and against NATO itself. So what we're doing is we're actually making a down payment on security long term by supporting Ukraine. And we've done it in the most efficient way possible. With a modest amount of aid over the course of 3 years, Ukraine has stalled out Russia, has broken its conventional military, has weakened Russia in its mischief making in Europe more broadly. Now we're tipping the scales in Russia's favor, kind of the worst possible scenario, or the worst logic behind advancing U.S. security.
You know, some might suggest that the policies of both Democratic and Republican presidencies, have been to really push back on Russia, right, for a long time and kind of keep them at bay. And so that saying of like, keep your friends close, your enemies even closer, that maybe it is time for a different strategy with Russia between the United States.
Yeah, so that's, I think, contrary to the research in this new book. I look at 6 different administrations, 30 plus years, and what I see is a consistent vein of Russia first. Why? Because we succumbed to hopes that we could accomplish more with Russia. They dangled bright, shiny objects, whether that's arms control, a valid thing that for us to pursue, or climate change, security, or cooperation to root out transnational terror. These things didn't really materialize in any substantial way. We had pockets of success around arms control. And at the same time, we succumbed to fears that if we did more to condemn Russia, as it graduated from just mischief making to hybrid warfare, interfering in elections in our country, but in other countries first along their border, and then graduated to military aggression, we didn't hold the line. We were very, very flexible consistently. We should have instilled some element of conditionality in the way we engaged with them early on, or condemnation and sanction as they graduated through all of these different destabilizing events. I think we've been way too flexible.
So you would just say that President Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin is just a continuation of what we've seen over the last 3 decades?
It is a doubling down and probably the most extreme example of the mistakes that we've made over the past 30 plus years. My research is clear and concise, clear on this point. I've interviewed the presidents involved on both the U.S. side and Ukrainian side, European leaders, and what I've seen is a consistent vein of a deep flexibility, putting Russia first. We bought into this principle that Russia, large military, large country, was entitled to some sort of privileged sphere of influence. Even when
But were they not with nuclear weapons? Were they not on some level?
On some level, they were. I think the fact is we made a valiant effort in the 1990s to bring them on sides. We made huge investments to try to bring them into the democratic world. Those countless meetings that Clinton had with his counterpart Yeltsin, but those didn't materialize. Right? Russia was just biding its time, letting its economy regain strength. Really getting fat off commodity prices in the 2000s. And when they gathered their strength, then acting aggressively to advance their efforts.
Do you remember back in 2012 when during that debate between Mitt Romney and President Obama, when Mitt Romney said that the U.S.'s number one geopolitical foe was Russia, and he was kind of laughed out of the room at that point. Was he right?
He was absolutely right. It looked like a distant prospect because we were in the midst of wars in the Middle East. It looked like it was a bygone era, but if you were paying attention, you saw the telltale signs in the 2000s. Really, years just into Putin's reign, you saw this effort to coerce neighbors, muck around in Ukraine's election that precipitated the Orange Revolution. Anybody that was paying attention to Georgia in 2008 and this war of aggression against Georgia, it was clear. But it just didn't resonate with the American public that wasn't paying attention to the direction that Russia was taking.
All right. So how are you, what are the optics that you are seeing in terms of what kind of deal might ultimately bring this war to an end? And what are the implications of that in your view and how you think it might play out?
So first of all, I want to give credit to both the Zelensky administration and the Trump administration. They rationalized this crazy $500 billion effort to draw funds out of Ukraine into something that makes sense. This deal that looks to be signed is a good deal. It's something that I talked about when I was in the White House. I was talking about the fact that we could cooperate with Ukraine on rare earths. We need them. We need them to drive our economy. They have them. They need investment. That all makes sense. Whether it actually advances the cause of peace, that's not entirely clear. There's no prescription in there for guarantees that the Ukrainians are looking for. It doesn't really forestall Russian aggression. What I see happening is right now the pattern is the U.S. is easing the pain on Russia, increasing the pain on Ukraine. I don't see how that brings Russia to the table. What I think is going to end up happening is that the Ukrainians are going to have to the Europeans are going to have to step in, double down on support as best as they can. They can't fill the vacuum of U.S. absence. We have the largest military industrial complex in the world, so they can't match that. But they could plug some holes and give the Ukrainians some staying power. Meanwhile, the Russians are taking significant losses. They're also getting drained economically, and they don't have they can't act forever with their manpower and then material. They're dwindling, digging into Soviet stockpiles. This is going to have to play out over the course of the next 6-9 months when the Russians realize that the Europeans are going to be there, the Ukrainians aren't going anywhere, and when Trump realizes that Putin is just dangling the prospect of some sort of a victory for him, but he's not delivering, Trump is going to want to win also. So we may even relook our policy and come back to support Ukraine, but it's going to be down the road after months of learning the lessons that we should have learned over the past 30 years.
We're speaking with a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. He's got a brand new book out. It's called The Folly of Realism: How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. Given your time studying both the governments of Ukraine and Russia, what would you say Vladimir Putin's ultimate goal is?
He's empire building. He's building his legacy. What he wants, what I think Russian elites have wanted really across generations is they want Russia to be strong. And in order to be strong, that means Ukraine has to be in the fold. It's a central notion to them that great Russia could only be great if it has little Russia. That's what they refer to Ukraine as, and Belarus. Those are the three kind of the trinity of Russian identity. So it wants to fold these countries and regions back in. And then what it's been doing since really the 16th century, the middle of the 16th century, it's expanded in all cardinal directions until it's been stopped, until it's hit a wall with other powers. So if they're given room, they will be aggressive and expand. If they are constrained, that is actually the recipe for Russia to reformat its belief in this, multipolar world in which Russia is a central pole, is through a recognition of the fact that they are not who they were under the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and they have much more limited capabilities, much more limited aspirations. That is the recipe for Russia to coexist with its neighbors.
Alexander, does that mean then a U.S. backstop of some sort for peacekeeping, means we need to see forces there U.S. forces to backstop Ukraine? Yeah. Is there some other kind of security guarantee that needs to be part of this?
I think that we don't have to put this question of troops on the table inside Ukraine anytime soon. The Ukrainians are capable of defending on their own with adequate support from the West.
Would U.S. workers working in the mineral space and that are on the ground in Ukraine, could that be part of a backstop?
In a peacetime context, I think that when there's a ceasefire, I think there's room for troops, peacekeepers to come in. There's room for workers to come in to cooperate on rare earths. Mm-hmm. I think the ultimate security guarantee is that Ukraine does join NATO, but out in a ceasefire context, somewhere after this war ends, and that prevents Russia from engaging in aggression down the road. I think it's hard. It's beyond the a belief that we would do that right now when there's a hot war going on.
Do you think that's a realistic possibility, given that this administration, including recently, the president said that Trump will never become part of NATO?
I think in this administration, there's no chance. But this administration has a clock also. We're talking about my time horizon is beyond 2028 when we return back to our pledges of 2008. That's a long time now, right? 20 years back to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Do you think that this war will continue until then?
I'm not sure if it continues until then, because the Russians don't have the staying power to continue until then. I think the fact is that the both sides will probably reassess deeper into 2025, maybe into the start of 2026. If the Russians are not able to get favorable conditions on the ground, then they'll look for some sort of off-ramp. It's
surprising to hear that, just because it really, truly does seem like President Trump wants to end this war. He talks almost every time, and we hear the president speaking a lot. He speaks to the press a lot. He always talks about the young people who are being killed in this conflict. It really seems to affect him. It really seems to motivate him to want to end this war.
Yeah, I think that might be true, but he's going about it repeating the mistakes of the past. I think the fact is, what's clear to me, if he wants to bring peace to the region, he should recognize that it's not the Ukrainians that are an impediment to peace. They're going to have to do what they absolutely must to preserve their sovereignty and territorial integrity, maybe giving up some territory in the short term. But it's the Russians that have absolutely maximalist objectives. They have not given up on Ukrainian capitulation. They have not given up on Ukraine, as a neutral player with no military that they could attack at will somewhere down the road. That's the party that he needs to recognize as an impediment to peace.
What can you tell us about, you were in the first Trump White House, first administration, and as we are now seeing the beginning of the second term play out, what insight can you give us about how the president thinks about issues and how things operate and how maybe different it is this time around, if you think it is different? Again, you're looking from the outside.
Yeah. I think from my perspective, what you have, and you could still see the tension between the policy pros that try to rationalize these decrees that Ukraine has to give $500 billion and come up with this, pretty sophisticated, interesting deal on rare earths. We had a lot more of those folks in the cabinet back then. You had, what were called adults in the room. These are accepted foreign policy professionals. Right now, you have a lot more yes men and loyalists. So you have stumbles from Secretary Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, that makes these declarations as if he's a Fox News anchor instead of the Secretary of Defense, holding out that a lot of these issues have to be resolved in negotiations. So I think there's still going to be an effort from the professional class to try to add clarity and resolve these pronouncements that Trump makes, it's just much tougher because I don't think the president's he has yes men and he's not getting, the most knowledgeable counsel. I'd advise them to read my book and they could see what it's shameless plug there, but to understand the mistakes of the past and how we can do better. The way we do better is we're not so transactional. We do not look at everything as a deal where we need to maximally extract. I mean, this is not a business environment. We can't maximally extract.
It's the balance of every administration, because there are deals all the time, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, right? Of deals being made to benefit citizens, countries, but there's always kind of a give and take.
But you want the Buffett deal. You want the Buffett deal that's long-term, long-sighted, and that's where the growth is over the course of, not just a cycle, but over a long term. And what I'm prescribing here is that we're not so transactional. We start thinking about the things that really matter to us. Democracies are the bedrock of both our security and our economic prosperity. That's where we should be investing resources, not the bright shiny object that's right immediately in front of us.
I think it's fair to say much of your career was not political in the sense of partisan politics.
None of it was until the very end.
So not none of it, but until the very end. You became certainly a lightning rod for politics. And, there are a lot of folks on the right who don't necessarily agree with you, especially after you testified in 2019 in the impeachment hearing. That said, do you still have the ear of people in the government right now? Do you have communications with them? Do you feel like you can talk to them?
So I feel like I could talk to them because I understand the terms in which to talk to them about, that Trump wants to be the winner and how to get a deal or something like that. So I could talk to him understanding the Trump White House and a little bit about his state of mind. But I have to contend with the proclivity is he likes Russia and he dislikes Ukraine. He likes strong men. He doesn't like our democratic allies. So there's only so much you could do there. At the same time, I don't really have the means to talk to Republicans. I'm happy to try and talk to them on the merits. You mentioned that, I became a political figure. I never really thought I still don't think of myself that way. I try to talk in terms of national security. In my 22 years in the military, working at the Pentagon, writing the strategy for Russia, all these different roles, what is it that's best for U.S. national security? Now, some people might see that being drawn into testifying in front of Congress when I reported presidential corruption is a political act, but it wasn't. It was a duty as somebody that swore an oath to the Constitution and then called by Congress to testify about what I witnessed. But I feel like there's not that much opportunity for the sides to talk together at all. It's not just me. It's communications between the folks that are perceived to be on the left and the folks that are perceived to be on the right. Although I don't know if I meet that bill. Some people might call me a hawk or something of that nature because I think we need a stronger, more muscular policy towards Ukraine. So it's just a moment where we're very, very tribal and we're not communicating with each other, even if it's on the merits.
Any regret in the action that you did in terms of testifying before Congress? I know you were subpoenaed, but we've seen subpoenas be issued and not everybody kind of testifies. So
absolutely not. I feel like those people that skirted their responsibilities for whatever personal, they did it for personal reasons. They did it because they didn't want to be the lightning rod or subject to criticism. That wasn't my job. My job was as a military officer, I was obligated by law to appear and testify. If I had been given a lawful order by Trump back then to not testify, things may have ended up differently. It would have had to play out in the courts. But the bottom line is I felt like what I did was right. I felt like I fulfilled my duty as an officer. And I could look my daughter, who's now 14, in her eyes and not say that I shirked responsibility. And continue to this day to frankly advocate for the things that matter to me, including a book that lands a month into Trump's administration that's critical of the mistakes that we seem to be repeating instead of learning from the past.
One thing I want to ask you, as a member of the military retired, we've seen the firing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We've seen other military leaders being let go. Also, the top lawyers, which is considered so important in terms of military actions and making sure that there is kind of a level of security, safety, if you will. Help us understand the military within a second Trump White House. And I do wonder about the independence of Because there are layers when we talk about democracy. There's judicial. There's like we talk about checks and balances, but military is an important part.
So the military is non-political. It serves at the pleasure of the president. Everybody swears an oath to the Constitution, and the officers in that chain of command, the commander-in-chief being the president of the United States. The thing is, this is not about these folks being disloyal. It's about the ability to ensure that when the president directs any element of the executive branch, that he has absolute loyalists that don't question anything. That was the reason that these 3-star JAGs were fired, these attorneys, is because they interpret the law. They'll determine and advise their 4-star bosses on whether the law orders that are coming down are legal. Now, the military is going to follow the president's instructions if it's a lawful order. Awful, they'll follow the instructions because he's the commander-in-chief. But what they won't do is they won't follow illegal orders. And I think this effort to sideline these 3 stars is to make sure that nobody interprets any instructions that come from the president. Not that anything has happened yet, but at any point in the future, that everything is interpreted as legal and that the officers in the military follow blindly, really.
So a guardrail has been removed.
Absolutely, a guardrail has been removed. These I know some of these 4 stars that I served with them, that have served. None of them did anything disloyal. I think on the face of it, it was. I think it was an attack on this whole DEI idea that there was some diversity amongst these folks, but all of these folks were going to follow the president's orders as long as they were legal. But that wasn't good enough.
Does it worry you that this guardrail has been removed?
I think it's a warning sign, and it's something that we should be mindful and cautious about. But we need to understand that the military is a large institution. These 4 stars have deputies that are 4 stars also, and the 3 stars that were removed have deputy 2 stars. So there are plenty of layers of folks that are going to hold the line. It just has gotten a little bit harder than it was before.
Well, you talk about levels, right, in terms of holding everybody to the true in military. What about someone like Secretary of the State Department, Marco Rubio? Like, what are your thoughts about him in dealing with global diplomacy and talking with leaders directly, and yet obviously they're at the grace of the president?
So I've had plenty of criticism of Marco Rubio in the past on policy differences, but he is a policy hand. He's been in the Senate for a while. He's been on intel committees. He understands the state of play in the world, the seriousness of these negotiations with Russia, how that might implicate Chinese aggression in the Pacific. He is going to try to do the best he can. I think he's going to try to do the best he can, whether he has the courage, the fortitude to withstand actors that don't want to really care or don't care about national security is a different story. I think Mike Waltz probably is in the same category. Mm-hmm. They're never going to criticize the president directly because they know what happens. That's the lessons have been learned in the first Trump administration, and I think they're going to try to probably do the best they can to rationalize some of the things that have been directed into policy that could advance U.S. national security interests. I have more confidence in these folks than I do in the purely political actors that really are unprepared for the positions they've been put into.
What do you say to people who say Alexander Vindman has got an axe to grind against the president? You testified against him. You sued some allies of the president for alleged intimidation over impeachment hearings. So what do you say to those? Because you've got this book out. It is very timely considering the geopolitics that consume much of what we talk about. What do you say to them?
My axe is sharp, actually, and I'm prepared to wield it in order to advance U.S. national security. And that's what my life has been about, a life of service to defend the nation. And if I feel like there needs to be something called out or criticism on the merits of national security and the dangers this country faces, I will wield that axe. But frankly, I don't like Trump. I mean, he personally attacked my family and targeted my family, made us targets of harassment and threats and things of that nature. But mainly, this is about this was my doctoral dissertation. Is about how do we keep this country safe and prosperous.
Just taking a hard turn in the last 30 seconds.
Because we all need to lighten up a little bit.
Yeah.
I've had this book on my desk, and whenever someone walks by, they say,
Wait.
I loved Vindman in Curb Your Enthusiasm. The penultimate season, you and Larry David.
Yeah.
How was it?
It was lots of fun. I did that season and actually the final episode. And it was a joy to do that. It was way outside of my comfort zone, being dragged into the public eye, but open to these new experiences, all sorts of different friends that I never had before. Being able to maybe leverage my voice in a way I didn't before. So it's a mixed. It's a blessing in that regard that I could lighten people's lives on Curb or give people some hope on the national security front. I'll embrace it, but I don't look back.